Tonight's tale is a little spooky, a little sleepy, and completely true, or almost. Before you drift off into dreamland, let's dim the lights, fluff the pillows, and whisper our way back to 1587. A lonely shore, a vanished village, and a bedtime mystery that's puzzled the world for centuries. The Roanoke colony. Over 100 people, just gone. Don't worry, you're not going anywhere if you tap that little like button and hit the notification bell too. It won't wake you up, I promise. You're safe, you're warm, and unlike our friends in Roanoke, they didn't subscribe, and look how that turned out. So close your eyes, let the waves of time carry you, soft and strange, to where secrets sleep beneath the trees. And before you vanish too, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? What time are you watching? And what tale should we dream through next? Let's vanish, slowly, mysteriously, into the past. At the edge of the world, as the misty dawn poured gold across Roanoke's sandy shore, 115 souls, sleep-deprived, seasick, boots sank into damp sand, deeply regretting not staying in London, where at least the rats were predictable, stepped from creaking boats on a strange cloaks, damp with ocean spray, doublets tugged tight against the breeze. They unloaded crates and barrels like they knew this wasn't just luggage, it was everything they owned. Behind them, the pine trees watched in silence. They looked around, squinting at this wilderness that smelled of salt and secrets. Somewhere, a gull called out like it knew something they didn't. The forest stood tall and still, as if holding its breath. And maybe, just maybe, it was. This was the first moment, the very beginning of something bold, or cursed, or both. No one knew they were stepping into a mystery that would echo for centuries. They just knew the sun was rising, the land was wild, and they had nowhere else to go. No one knew if it would be a triumph or a ghost story in the making. Governor John White, artist turned reluctant explorer, had been sent to govern this strange dream of a colony. But as he peered into the morning fog, one could sense he wasn't entirely sure who was in charge. Him, the wilderness, stood at the edge of the world, or at least the edge of his map. Not just any map, his map, stained with salt, smudged with hope, and filled with more guesses than certainties. Tall, with a beard seasoned by the Atlantic, was neatly trimmed, though he hadn't seen a mirror in week, and a forehead furrowed from weeks of sea mutiny, still as stone, with the sea humming behind him. He squinted at the plan he'd drawn the corner of the map, a plan to build a colony, raise a future. He muttered to himself like a man consulting invisible spirits. Yes, the bay curves here. He'd painted maps before, many in fact, but this place, it refused to be captured. Every tree looked familiar and utterly foreign. Behind him, settlers bustled and unpacked. Ahead, the pine forest watched. John whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "Let's not get eaten." The new world waited, half discovered, half invented, and entirely unaware it was about to become a bedtime story. This wasn't just the new world. It was a place that seemed to hold its own secrets and possibly its own rules. And Roanoke breathed out its first silent warning. In a quiet patch of forest, naturalist Thomas Harriot had already decided this flower deserved a biography. Knelt gently among ferns, one knee in the damp moss, his quill twitching with excitement, he sketched its petals like it was a royal portrait, muttering something about unrecorded genus and definitely not from England. Ferns swayed gently around him, like an audience of leafy admirers. He was half scientist, half poet, and 100% likely to be bitten by something exotic by nightfall. The forest whispered around him. It had its own language, one of rustling leaves, twitching shadows, and birds that stared a bit too long. Behind him, unseen eyes watched, some feathered, some furred, some, who knows. Harriet wasn't worried. He was here for knowledge, not drama. But as his quill scraped across parchment, even he felt it, that strange pulse in the woods. Something was watching as the last amber brushstroke of sun vanished behind the pines. Twilight settled gently over the clearing, like a hush falling across a cathedral. A modest campfire crackled to life at the heart of the forest, casting flickering halos of gold on tired, soot-smudged faces. The settlers, wrapped in linen and wool and the strange stillness of an unfamiliar land, drew closer to the flames, not just for warmth, but for a fragile sense of togetherness. They passed around tin cups filled with something vaguely broth-like, shared bites of salted pork that tasted like regret, and exchanged murmurs that might have been prayers, or simply questions no one dared ask aloud. Every snap of a twig in the woods sent eyes darting, though no one mentioned it. Even bravery, it seems, can be worn out by sea voyages and homesickness, and yet, above them, a vault of stars slowly unveiled itself, fresh and wild, as if no one had ever dared wish upon them before. The wind hummed through the tall pines like an old lullaby, and for one brief breath in time, this ragtag constellation of souls felt less like strangers and more like a story just beginning. They didn't know it yet, but the fire wasn't just for warmth, it was the first flicker of myth. A little apart from the fire's warm gossip, Eleanor Dare sat cross-legged in the soft pine-needled earth, her breath steady, her shawl drawn snug like a secret. Her belly, round as the moon rising above the treetops, rose and fell with the rhythm of two hearts beating quietly beneath linen folds. In her hand, a simple stick became a quill, and the dirt her parchment as she traced lazy spirals into the ground, over and over, as if trying to write a lullaby no one had taught her yet. She didn't speak. Words were too heavy for moments like this. Instead, she hummed an old Devonshire tune that drifted like a ghost on the breeze, mingling with the crackle of fire and the far-off cry of something feathered and possibly judgmental in the trees. Her gaze lifted skyward often, searching the canopy as though some ancient answer might blink back down through the leaves. The others nearby laughed softly, passed cups, dreamed of home. But Eleanor dreamed of something stranger, of the child within her, stirring slightly as if eavesdropping on the wind, and of the unknowable world this child would enter. Hope, it turns out, doesn't need trumpets or banners. Sometimes it just hums in the dark and draws circles in the dirt. Just past the flickering edge of firelight, where the warmth dared not reach and the dark grew thick and wild, something moved, no louder than a sigh through pine needles, no clearer than a thought half remembered. There, between two ancient trees, a figure lingered, or perhaps it was a trick of the smoke, a mischief of shadow and fog. Still, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The settlers, snug in their circle of light, passed tin cups and soft chuckles, none the wiser. But their skin knew, it always does. A tingle at the back of the neck, a sudden itch to glance over one's shoulder, as if the woods themselves had grown a pair of eyes, curious ones, quiet ones, not necessarily friendly. The wind turned just enough to carry a hush across the clearing. The fire popped politely. Somewhere an owl coughed, or hooted, it's unclear. But that shape between the trees didn't blink, it didn't budge, just watched as if trying to remember who these strange people were, or whether they'd make good neighbors or dinner. In this new world where even the moonlight feels unfamiliar, there are things the fire cannot chase away, and some of them have been waiting a very, very long time. Governor John White knelt in the sand like a man sketching the future with a stick, and perhaps in some way he was. His coat, dusted with the fine Carolina soil, flared at the edges like the pages of an unfinished book. Under the watchful moon, he carved lines into the earth. Here a fort, there a garden, maybe a well, and, why not, a tavern eventually, when someone figured out how to brew something stronger than pine tea. His brow creased with the burden of decisions. The fate of over 100 souls rested in this hasty doodle on the ground. Yet even as he mapped out order, behind him loomed the great disorder, the forest, vast and humming with secrets, pines that whispered among themselves, shadows that didn't always wait for nightfall. John muttered to himself, perhaps narrating his own plans, or just fending off the creeping sense that the woods were listening. Fort goes here, barracks there, and we'll put the latrines very far downwind. The sand gave easily under his stick, but nothing else here did. He paused, staring at the map, as if hoping it might whisper back a suggestion. But the only reply was the rustle of leaves and the sigh of a wind that had seen many strangers come and go. And John White, determined dreamer with dusty knees, was still deciding which he'd be. Just before dawn stretched her golden fingers across the trees. A scream split the hush like a dropped kettle on stone. The camp jolted awake, blankets flew, weapons clattered, and hearts leapt straight into throats. A few brave souls, still tangled in cloaks and dreams, grabbed muskets with the business end facing the wrong way. Others simply stared, bleary-eyed and startled, into the mist that curled like sleepy ghosts through the pine trunks. In the center of it all stood Thomasine Cooper, barefoot and breathless, one arm trembling toward the woods. It was like a man, she whispered, eyes wide as moons. But it wasn't. She didn't blink, nobody breathed. Even the birds had the good sense to stay silent. There was no sign of an intruder, no paw prints, no boot tracks, just mist and morning dew and a lingering unease thick as porridge. John White, now half-dressed and wholly annoyed, sighed through his mustache. "We haven't even built a fence yet," he muttered, "and already the forest is sending guests." Everyone laughed nervously, too loud, too quickly. Fear, it turned out, made a poor bedfellow and an even worse breakfast companion. And though the sun soon rose and the shadows thinned, something behind the trees had already made itself known. By the time the moon traded places with the stars, something miraculous stirred within the colony's canvas walls. A cry rang out, not of fear nor of pain, but of brand new lungs discovering the world. Virginia Dare, small and squalling, had arrived, wrapped not in silk, but in hope and flannel. The first English child born on American soil, a gentle rebellion against the wilderness. Inside the lantern-lit tent, Eleanor Dare held her daughter like a prayer finally answered. Her face glowed with exhaustion, wonder, and something deeper, an ancient calm known only to those who've met their own courage face to face. The baby's tiny fist curled around nothing and everything all at once. John White, grandfather and governor, sat beside her, utterly undone. Tears slid quietly down his weather-worn cheeks. He reached out, not to lead or command, but simply to hold a piece of something pure. Around them, the colonists gathered in silence, watching as if the child might suddenly rise and speak prophecy. One man tried to clap, but thought better of it. This wasn't a moment for noise. Outside, the forest listened too. Even the trees leaned in, as if marking the birth with a hush of pine needle lullabies. For a breathless moment, joy had weight, and fear had no place to land. It was just after breakfast, if you could call dried peas and tepid water breakfast, when young Thomas Birch wandered a little too far with a bundle of kindling. His feet, like his thoughts, had a habit of drifting. That's when I saw it. There, on the side of an old cypress tree, half swallowed by moss and time, were carvings, strange ones, spirals nested inside spirals, shapes that looked like eyes, too many of them, and lines that bent just a little wrong, like a story told backwards. Thomas froze, stick bundle forgotten, and pointed with the solemn authority only a 10-year-old can muster. "It's got eyes," he said plainly. "The tree's watching." The nearby menfolk came trotting over, boots crunching through brush, expecting maybe a snake or something useful. But they saw the markings too, older than any of them. Worn but not weathered away, not English, not idle scratches from a bored hand. The air thickened, no wind, no birds, just the steady thrum of the forest, and a silence that settled too quickly, as though the woods were suddenly listening in. John White arrived and studied the bark with narrowed eyes. "Could be native," he muttered, but not convincingly. Or he trailed off, as if the rest of that sentence was better left unsaid. They didn't cut the tree, they didn't touch it, they just backed away slowly, as though the bark might blink. The woods had a language, it seemed, and it had just spoken first. As twilight draped itself over the camp like a velvet curtain, 5 figures moved beneath a sagging canvas stretched between pine trunks. It wasn't much, a makeshift roof barely taller than a man, but it kept the dew off and gave their meeting a certain theatrical flair. Beneath the flicker of 2 oil lanterns, their shadows danced on the bark like nervous spirits. John White stood at the head of the gathering, hands resting on a tattered map, splayed atop a barrel. The map was wrinkled, smudged, and patched with hopeful guesses, like much of their expedition. Beside him was Thomas Harriot, the science-minded one, who always seemed to be chewing on invisible equations. Ananias Dare, Eleanor's husband, paced behind them with a frown that had practically taken up permanent residence on his face. 2 others, quiet men with louder opinions, rounded out the assembly. The debate crackled like the fire nearby. Should they stay by the coast and await the return of the supply ship, or venture inland toward rumors of friendlier tribes and fertile ground? Every suggestion was met with a sigh, a squint, or a muttered prayer. Between their hushed voices, the forest answered with its own silence, dense and unmoved. Somewhere out there, in the ink-black woods, answers waited, or dangers did. For now, all they had was the map, the dim lantern light, and a sense that they were not the only ones holding counsel beneath those trees. After all, the forest had ears, possibly very large ones. The fire had died down to glowing embers when a quiet rustle stirred at the edge of camp. Not the wind, not an animal. No, this was deliberate, feet stepping gently over pine needles, as if even the forest itself were holding its breath. Mateo emerged from the shadows like a whisper given form. Draped in ceremonial robes of feathers and beads, he stood just outside the circle of firelight, half-lit and wholly mysterious. His face, carved in solemn lines, betrayed little, but his eyes carried the stillness of ages. The settlers rose slowly, startled yet comforted. Mateo was their friend, their CROATOAN guide, a bridge between worlds. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he watched the flames as though asking them permission. Then, in quiet tones, he shared news from upriver, stories of lights that flickered with no fire, of voices that mimicked the living, and of hunters who vanished without a sound. He did not speak of danger directly. That was not his way. But his warnings floated through the air like smoke, shapeless, lingering, and impossible to ignore. Mateo finished, then stepped back into the darkness as smoothly as he had arrived, leaving behind a silence that pressed in like fog. No one returned to sleep easily that night, not even the fire. The camp had long since quieted, the fire reduced to soft orange pulses. Inside a tent stitched from sailcloth and hope, Eleanor Dare lay curled on a woven mat, her newborn daughter nestled close. The baby breathed in tiny sighs, the rhythm of new life syncing with the distant lull of crickets and the faint hush of pine needles whispering above. Sleep took her gently, like fog rolling over the dunes, and with it came the dream. A woman stood in the forest, not a settler, not a spirit, but something in between. Cloaked in robes of blue mist, her face was veiled yet somehow kind, sorrowful and strange. The trees bowed as she passed. Her lips moved, murmuring in a language that was not made for mouths, older than stars, like wind carved into stone. It wasn't frightening, not exactly, but Eleanor's skin tingled as if her very soul had been noticed. Then came a single word, spoken or perhaps woven into the silence, CROATOAN. She woke with a start, eyes wide in the silver moonlight filtering through canvas. The baby stirred, unharmed, still dreaming infant dreams. But Eleanor couldn't shake it. The name still echoed in her mind like a lullaby that didn't belong to her. She wasn't alone in that tent, not entirely. Morning unfurled slowly over Roanoke like a lazy yawn, and with it came the unmistakable rhythm of effort, axes thudding, saws rasping, and grunts of settlers wrestling with the stubborn wilderness. The sun climbed higher, pouring golden light over their labors as tree after tree fell, stripped of bark and pride, and hauled toward the rising barricade. It was a palisade, or at least the beginning of one, a humble necklace of logs meant to keep the wild things out and the fragile things in. Sweat glistened on sunburnt brows, sleeves were rolled and tempers only half contained. Children, sticky with sap and dirt, carried wooden pails sloshing with warm water and warm complaints. Someone whistled a tune that sounded brave until it cracked in the heat. John White supervised with his usual stern squint, as if staring long enough at the walls might make them rise faster or taller. Ananias Dare barked instructions that mostly went ignored. One post at a time, the circle tightened, yet as each timber thudded into the soil, a quiet truth settled in too. These weren't just walls for safety, they were lines drawn between this new world and whatever watched them from the woods. was starting to feel less like building a home and more like bracing for a storm. By the time the sun dipped low and bled gold into the trees, someone was missing. James Howe, the carpenter with the loud laugh and stronger back, had simply vanished. His tools remained, chisels laid out with intention, saw resting like it expected to be picked up any moment. A half-built ladder leaned lazily against the frame, the final rungs like an unfinished thought left dangling in the air. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just absence, a perfectly carved silence. They called for him, of course, shouted his name with a mixture of hope and irritation. Perhaps he'd wandered for firewood. Perhaps he'd gone to relieve himself and got distracted, though by what, in a land this strange, was anyone's guess? A squirrel with secrets? A bush whispering riddles? As darkness deepened, the voices grew softer, more careful. The forest didn't answer, but it listened. Oh yes, it listened. The pine trees, tall and still, gave nothing back. Later, someone said they found a single boot print, pointed toward the woods, not away. No one said it out loud, but the camp felt thinner somehow, as if the air itself had receded, and the ladder, still leaning, looked a little lonelier than it should. The night was thick and close, like a woolen blanket pulled just a little too tight. In the hush of his tent, John White sat hunched over a battered wooden table, his face lit softly by a lone lantern. The flame flickered like it too, was hesitant to stay in this place much longer. His journal lay open before him, leather-bound, weather-stained, loyal, a feather quill in hand. White dipped it slowly into ink, the motion almost meditative. Then carefully, as if each letter might summon or dispel a ghost, he began to write. August 23rd, one man gone, Howe, the carpenter, no cry nor fight, tools left idle. The woods answer not, yet I feel their gaze. He paused, listened. The pine trees outside sighed under the wind, or was it something else? Something breathing? I feel watched. The ink on the page trembled slightly as his hand hovered, not with fear, no, not quite, but with something close, like the uneasy flutter in your chest when you think you hear footsteps behind you, only to find shadows. He closed the journal gently, as if not to wake it, and leaned back. The lantern crackled, casting crooked silhouettes across the canvas walls. Outside, the forest held its secrets. Inside, White kept writing them down, just in case someone, someday, would want to know how it all began. That night, the forest didn't sleep, and neither did the settlers. The wind, usually a familiar friend, rustled with something different. It carried no chill, no storm, no breeze that one could name. Instead, it threaded through the trees like a ghost, weaving a lullaby, one not meant to soothe, but to stir. And from that rustling came whispers, not animal calls, not the groan of branches, whispers, soft, secretive, too hushed to understand, too human to ignore. Inside their tents, the colonists lay still, eyes wide, breath shallow. Even the loudest among them, yes, even boisterous Giles, who once tried to outshout thunder, was now silent, clutching his blanket like it might protect his soul. Some dared to peek out through the flaps, hoping to see nothing and fearing to see something. The moon spilled its pale light over the misty trees, casting shadows that danced like curious spirits. Was it the wind just being playful? Or were the trees telling stories? Stories the settlers weren't meant to hear. The forest breathed around them, alive, aware. And deep within the fog, something listened back. But Worry not, dear dreamer. It's just the woods having a little midnight gossip. Close your eyes, snuggle in tight. The whispers aren't for you. Not yet. Thomas Harriot fancied himself a man of reason, a scholar, an astronomer, a collector of facts and figures. But on this particular afternoon, reason took a little stroll and never quite came back. There he stood in the middle of the Roanoke forest, boots damp with moss, a brass compass trembling in his palm. The needle, which should have pointed politely northward, had instead decided to dance in frantic little circles, whirling as if possessed or utterly confused. He'd passed by an odd arrangement of ancient stones, tall moss-blanketed things, arranged just irregularly enough to feel deliberate. Not carved, not marked, just watching, as if the earth itself had set them there in a ritual long forgotten. No iron nearby, no magnetic tricks, just Thomas, a circle of stones, and a compass doing the jitterbug. He held his breath, stepped back, one pace, two. The needle slowed, another step, and it stilled, returning to its proper business, like nothing had happened. But the calm in the needle did not return to Thomas's mind. His thoughts remained in a spin, just like the compass had. Was this ancient magic, a local joke, or had the forest simply decided to mock science for the evening? He chuckled nervously to himself. Well, he muttered, either I've discovered a new natural phenomenon, or I've just been politely told to leave. And he did, slowly, compass tucked away, eyes over his shoulder. Because the stones, they didn't blink. The word came softly at first, CROATOAN, like the wind was murmuring it through the trees. Then it started to show up in places it had no business being, etched into the bark of oaks with such care it looked almost reverent, scrawled in charcoal along the inside of tents, even pressed faintly into the ash of last night's fire, CROATOAN. No one saw who did it, no one confessed, and yet there it was, again and again. Eleanor Dare found it just before dusk, behind her sleeping mat, scratched low as if by a child's hand. She stared at it for a long while, brushing her fingers across the faint grooves. The letters weren't quite straight. The A wobbled, but it was unmistakable. She stepped out into the night air, only to see others glancing nervously at trees, at footprints, at shadows. One man swore he'd heard the word whispered in his ear while bending for firewood. Another found it carved onto the handle of his water bucket. Each insisted it hadn't been there before. Was someone playing tricks, sending a message? Or was the island itself trying to say something? No one knew. But that night, no one slept very well. They lay still in their tents, eyes open, ears straining. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches, and somewhere, deep in the trees, a voice almost, but not quite, spoke the word again, CROATOAN. The 12th night brought more than silence. It brought a decision. John White, artist, governor, and increasingly sleep-deprived soul, stood before the haggard circle of colonists, the firelight casting his face in gold and shadow. Supplies were running low. Morale was drifting. The forest was no longer just strange. It was listening. He cleared his throat gently. I must return to England, he said, his voice wrapped in hesitation and salt air. For aid, for ships, for hope a hush fell, thick as fog. He didn't have to explain why. Everyone felt it. If something wasn't done soon, they wouldn't last another moon. He promised 3 months. Just one season, he said. He would return with fresh supplies, new settlers, and maybe even a decent barrel of English beer. The last bit earned a weak smile. At dawn, Eleanor Dare stood with him on the beach. The waves lapped gently at their feet, as if trying to tug him back before he'd even left. He hugged her tightly, then leaned down to kiss the soft brow of little Virginia, cradled in swaddling cloth. Neither of them spoke. There was too much to say. John stepped aboard the boat, turned once more to the shore, and raised a hand. The ship drifted into the morning mist, and Roanoke watched him vanish into the sea. A promise whispered to the tide. 3 months. But the sea, as we know, doesn't keep promises. The ship groaned softly as it eased away from the shore, its old wooden bones creaking like they, too, were unsure of this parting. The sails billowed wide, catching the morning breeze like great ghostly wings. Dawn painted the waves in sleepy gold, and the sky above yawned in pastel silence. John White stood at the stern, wrapped in his weathered cloak, the chill of sea spray clinging to his beard. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon ahead, though the colony, his colony, was still there, growing smaller behind him, swallowed bit by the mist, curling over the waves like fingers around a secret. He did not turn back, not because he didn't care, quite the opposite. To look back would have unspooled him. Eleanor's eyes, little Virginia's soft coos, the rising smoke of morning fires, the fragile experiment of Roanoke, so bold, so delicate, perched between wilderness and hope. But duty pulled him forward, across an ocean he knew too well and trusted too little. England waited, supplies were needed, promises had been made. 3 months, he'd said, just 3. The ship creaked louder now, as if nudging him onward. A gull cried above, then vanished into the mist. Behind him, Roanoke blurred into the white hush of dawn, as if it had never been real at all. And still, John White did not look back. Summer arrived, not with joy, but with a heavy breath, hot, damp, and humming with insects, too bold to fear man. The sun hung low and lazy in the sky, drenching the wooden huts in gold one moment, then burning them dry the next. Roanoke did not wilt exactly, but it grew still. Without John White, the settlement lost its voice. His maps remained behind, but maps cannot soothe tempers or divide fish evenly. Small squabbles about salt, about firewood, about who stole whose turnip, sputtered like dying campfires. There were no great fights, just long echoing silences afterward. The laughter that once danced around the cooking fires now curled away like smoke, thin and uncertain. Children played less, adults watched more, and the forest, the forest, seemed to inch closer each night, as if curious or hungry. Time passed not in days, but in the sag of shoulders and the deepening lines beneath tired eyes. Even the birds seemed quieter, save for the occasional crow that cawed too loud for comfort. That bird, people whispered, had been watching them for weeks. Summer bloomed, yes, but it bloomed like a fever, humid, slow, unrelenting. The colony held its breath, and in the absence of John White, every breeze felt like a question. The forest does not forget, but it does change. When the hunting party set off, they carried flint, rope, and Mateo's careful directions folded in oilcloth. The trail he had once traced with ease was meant to lead to water, wild game, perhaps even friendly faces. But days passed, then more. The trees, when they returned, seemed taller. At last, the men stumbled back, scratched, dirt-caked, their boots caked with mud that smelled strangely sweet. Their eyes blinked too much, as if sunlight stung them. They spoke little, and when pressed, only muttered, The path, it turned. Their spears hung limp in their hands, tips dulled. One carried a bundle of feathers, but he could not remember why. Another had lost his hat and wore a crown of leaves he didn't seem to notice. The colonists watched them warily. No game, no fresh water, no stories. Just silence and the steady creak of joints moving like old doors. One child whispered, "They smell like rain," and no one knew what she meant. Later, some dared ask again where the trail had gone. "There is no trail," one of the men finally said. "Only the trees now." And so it was. The forest had changed its mind. Eleanor sat by the river bank as the dusk tiptoed in, gentle and gray. Baby Virginia nestled against her chest, a tiny hand curled like a question. The wind didn't speak, the trees didn't creak. Even the river, that endless storyteller, hushed itself. She dipped her fingers in the slow-moving water, not to fetch, not to clean, just to feel something move. The ripples drifted out like echoes, as if she were asking the stream to carry her lullabies somewhere. Perhaps to someone. The tune she sang was familiar, but the words frayed at the edges. A mother's song, half remembered, half lost. Her voice cracked on the third verse and never quite found the fourth. Somewhere behind her, the settlement shifted. Wooden planks settling with sighs, a door creaking without a hand. But here, by the river, it was only Eleanor and Virginia, caught in the stillness between a breath in and a breath out. No birds sang. She looked up once, not sure what she expected to see. Maybe sails on the horizon, maybe her father walking out of the woods with supplies and stories and relief. But the world had gone quiet, like it was waiting for her to speak first. She didn't. She just held her daughter and listened for answers that never came. It began as a flicker, small, nervous, like a candle unsure of its purpose. Then it grew, licking the night sky in wild orange tongues just beyond the tree line. A signal fire, finally, a sign. They rushed through the underbrush, hearts knocking against ribs, lanterns swinging like uncertain moons. Maybe White had returned early. Maybe another ship. Maybe something good. But when they arrived, the clearing offered only disappointment and smoke. The fire was gone. Only a scatter of hot ash remained, smoldering like a sigh. The ground around it held no prints, no path, no proof that anyone had ever been there at all. The trees stood innocent, tight-lipped, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. One settler reached into the ash with a stick and poked at it, as if meaning might rise from the cinders like a phoenix. It didn't. The smoke curled upward, slowly, lazily, like it was bored with them. No voices, no footsteps, no warmth, just questions. Someone whispered, perhaps it was a warning. Another muttered, or a joke. Eleanor just stared at the fading smoke, her eyes reflecting the fire that wasn't there anymore. A signal had been sent, but no message had followed. Just a burnt offering to the mystery that now walked among them. And the night closed in again. The word had begun to trail them like a shadow, CROATOAN. It clung to tree trunks, carved in a hurried hand, half hidden beneath moss. It rustled in the underbrush, hissed from the leaves, slipped between dreams like a whisper with purpose. And so, once more, the idea returned. Migrate south, follow the signs, seek the CROATOAN people, seek safety, or at least seek something. They gathered near the edge of the woods as twilight settled like velvet on their shoulders. The path ahead seemed overgrown, but not closed, as if the forest were waiting, inviting maybe. but with the grin of something that knows more than it tells. Manteo stood at the front, still as the trees, his eyes far older than the years he wore. "If you go," he said, voice soft as dusk, "you will not come back the same. The land, it remembers everyone who steps too deep." Some settlers looked away. Others clutched satchels tighter, pretending not to be afraid. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. One woman asked, "Will it be better there?" Manteo did not answer. Instead, a branch snapped in the distance, sharp, deliberate. And just like that, the forest reminded them. The decision was theirs, but the consequences were not. It was a child who found it, barefoot and bored, as most children are when surrounded by hushed adults and looming trees. Just beyond the edge of camp, near the roots of a half-dead pine, something odd caught her eye. A symbol scratched crudely into the sand. Curved lines intersected in unnatural ways, like a letter from no known language. Or maybe a face that had forgotten how to smile. No one knew what it meant. "It's nothing," said one settler, brushing it away with the heel of his boot. "Just idle doodlin'." But children rarely doodle in riddles, and certainly not ones that return overnight. Because come morning, there it was again, drawn deeper this time, as if made with care or intent. The adults didn't speak of it much. They whispered, "Sure," as adults do when something doesn't fit. But no one claimed it, and no one watched the child too closely as she stood near it again, her tiny fingers twitching like she almost remembered drawing it in her sleep. By evening, every footprint around the mark had been erased by wind, or something else. Only the symbol remained. And that night, even the campfire seemed to burn a little quieter, as if listening. By the flicker of a stubby candle, Eleanor dipped her quill and let her thoughts spill softly onto the page. The ink bled slowly, like it too was tired from weeks of worry. Outside, the trees creaked as if eavesdropping. She began the letter the way one might start a prayer. "To my dear father, John White." But soon, the words twisted into something else. Not a message, exactly. More like a confession dressed as a goodbye. She wrote of shadows that moved when no one walked, of voices that murmured from empty corners, of how Virginia laughed at nothing, nothing visible, at least, and clapped her tiny hands at invisible games. She paused often, hand trembling, not from cold, but from the sense that someone or something was reading over her shoulder. Still, she folded the letter gently, as one might swaddle a secret. She wrapped it in cloth and tucked it beneath a loose floorboard, beneath a box, beneath everything known. Then she blew out the candle, and the hut fell into darkness. Not quiet, though, never quiet. There was always a sound, a creak, a sigh, a faint rustle, as if the colony itself refused to sleep. And Eleanor, in the hush, simply whispered, "Please come back soon." Morning came slow and gray, as if even the sun was reluctant to rise. Dew clung to every leaf, every canvas flap, every hushed breath. But something else clung too. Absence. 2 beds lay undisturbed, still tucked as neatly as the night before. Boots neatly aligned, cloaks hanging. No signs of struggle, no creak of door, nor call for help. Just gone. As if the earth had quietly exhaled and taken them in. The settlers gathered with sleep-heavy eyes and heavier hearts, speaking in whispers, as if afraid to disturb whatever rule had been broken. A teapot sat cold, untouched. A wooden spoon dangled off a hook, swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. No one said the word taken, but the forest loomed with that knowing hush again, thick with mist and secrets, like it had witnessed something it wouldn't share. One man suggested a search party, but the silence that followed was answer enough. Even Mateo, who'd braved more trails than anyone, stared into the trees and simply shook his head. And so they waited and watched. And when night came again, every tent flap was tied shut. Not that it had helped the others, but humans cling to rituals when logic no longer keeps them safe. And somewhere, just beyond the trees, something listened. The fire cracked gently, casting golden light on faces too tired to flinch anymore. Sparks rose like sleepy fireflies, vanishing into the velvet of night. The colony stood gathered, shoulders close, breath visible in the cooling air. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but steady as flint. Virginia slept, slung across her chest, a bundle of fragile hope. She didn't shout, she didn't plead. Her voice was soft, like something pulled from a dream that lingers long after waking. "We move south," she said. "We follow CROATOAN." No one argued. There was no need. The decision had already been made for them, whispered in rustling leaves, etched into the sand, murmured by vanishing footsteps and half-remembered dreams. It was in the way the forest stared back now. It was in the wind that no longer felt like just wind. Some nodded, others simply looked down, resigned or relieved. A few closed their eyes as if listening to something deep beneath the trees, something that had been calling them all along. Even Mateo, standing at the edge of the circle, gave a small nod. Not approval, acknowledgement. And as the fire burned low, so too did the last thread tying them to Roanoke. Tomorrow they would follow the path etched by mystery, lit not by reason, but by the oldest guide of all, the pull of the unknown. The sun hadn't quite risen, but the light was already changing, soft and silvery, like the breath of the sea come to hush them goodbye. Mist clung to the grass in thin ribbons, curling around ankles as if trying to tug them back. Just one more moment. No one spoke. The colony moved like sleepwalkers, carefully folding blankets, hoisting baskets, tying what little remained into neat, reluctant bundles. Even the trees seemed to lean in, watching quietly. Eleanor cradled Virginia in a shawl stitched from old sailcloth, once meant to catch wind, now meant to hold warmth. The baby stirred, sighed, and went on dreaming. Eleanor looked at her daughter, then at the camp behind them, and did not cry, not yet. The huts stood hollow now, like they knew they were about to be forgotten. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. Doors hung slightly open, as if they, too, were unsure. There was no ceremony, just motion. One by one, the settlers fell into a line, not quite orderly, not quite lost. A trail of ghosts leaving behind the skeleton of a hope. Somewhere in the woods, a crow called once, then fell silent. And so, without fanfare, without farewell, Roanoke was left to the mist, and the mystery began to walk. At first light, they crossed the threshold, out of the world they knew, and into the one that waited. The pine forest opened its arms with tall, ancient grace, each trunk standing still as sentinels. No birds called, no wind stirred, just the soft crunch of boots on needle-covered earth and the faint creak of old leather packs. The golden light spilled like honey through the trees, pooling on the forest floor. It should have felt warm. It didn't. It felt watched. Mateo walked ahead, silent as a thought. His feet knew the way, even if his heart doubted it. He didn't glance back once, not at the colony, not at Eleanor, not at the sky slowly brightening behind them. Some things, when left, must stay left. The settlers followed in a quiet procession, each one carrying more than supplies, hopes, regrets, questions too heavy to voice. The forest smelled of sap and secrets, of stories whispered long before they arrived, of things that walked beside them without sound. A twig snapped, not ahead, not behind, somewhere off the path, but Mateo didn't flinch, neither did Eleanor. Whatever this journey was, it had already begun long before their feet touched the trail. And so they walked on into the hush of towering pines, where even the sunlight seemed to hold its breath. They camped in a clearing where the trees leaned close, as if eavesdropping. Above, stars pricked the velvet sky, dim and flickering, like shy eyes watching from afar. The fire crackled softly, tossing shadows that danced across canvas tents like silent puppets. Eleanor sat with Virginia, curled in her arms, her eyes fixed on the dark between the trees. The baby slept, but Eleanor did not, nor did anyone else. The wind didn't blow, yet something rustled. A branch snapped, not too far, not too near, just close enough to wonder. Then another. The fire popped loudly, startling no one. They were already listening too hard. Some settlers stared into the flames like they could divine answers in the embers. Others fiddled with straps, twine, anything to keep their hands busy. No one spoke. Words might invite things in. From time to time, someone glanced at Mateo. He offered no comfort, just a slow blink and a stillness carved from something older than fear. Eleanor leaned down and whispered a lullaby to Virginia. It didn't matter if the child could understand, maybe the woods could, and still the stars blinked on, and still the trees leaned in, and not a single soul slept. That night, the fire seemed smaller than usual. No one fed it. It burned just enough to keep the darkness curious. Near its edge, a young boy sat hugging his knees, eyes wide and unblinking. His name was Adam, though he wouldn't say it again for quite some time. He told Eleanor he'd heard his mother calling, but his mother had been asleep beside the fire, snoring like a tired raccoon in a bonnet. The voice had come from the trees. It had said his name, just once, just enough, but it didn't sound right, he whispered. It sounded like her, but backwards. No one laughed. The forest was quiet, too quiet for comfort, yet too alive for peace. The shadows between the pines thickened like ink. Some shapes held still too long. Others didn't stay still enough. Mateo stirred and murmured something about old spirits with new tricks. No one asked for clarification. Adam refused to sleep. He just sat there, wide-eyed, lips pressed tight, the way children do when they're afraid something might crawl in if they open their mouths. And the voice, whoever it was, whatever it was, never called again, not out loud, but from then on no one wandered far from the fire, because in the Roanoke woods, not every whisper stays in the dark. It was the second morning of their quiet march southward when they found the tree. Not just any tree. This one looked like it had been around since time took its first nap. A gnarled old oak, its bark thick as armor, rising like a sentinel from the misty underbrush. And there, carved deep and wide into its weathered skin, was the word CROATOAN. The letters were rough, uneven, like someone in a hurry, or someone unsure if they were meant to be spelling at all. Fresh enough that the sap still wept from the wounds, but no one admitted to doing it. Eleanor pressed her palm to the bark, as if the tree might speak back. It didn't, of course. Oaks are famously tight-lipped. The settlers gathered around, murmuring. Some crossed themselves. One man suggested it might be a sign from God. Another said it looked more like the handwriting of a drunk ghost. Mateo simply stared, silent as stone, and yet somehow it felt right, as though the forest was not merely letting them pass, but nudging them along. Still, no one could quite say why it gave them chills. Maybe it was the way the word glowed faintly in the morning mist. Or maybe it was the fact that the path forward suddenly seemed more like a summons than a choice. Either way, they kept walking. And the tree, well, it kept watching. By midday, the weary line of colonists reached a river they didn't recognize, or perhaps one that no longer recognized them. The map said it should bend west. The stars agreed. Even Mateo had once led them along its familiar curves. But today, it flowed backward, upstream, not in a subtle, curious ripple, but in a full-bodied, defiant rush, as if the water had somewhere important to be and didn't care for the usual rules. They stared in silence. The surface gleamed like a mirror pulled taut, and below, shadows twisted that didn't quite belong to fish. One settler dropped a stick into the current. It spun once, then zipped upstream with a soggy confidence. Several hats were removed and held to hearts. One man muttered something about cursed moons. Mateo stood at the bank, his gaze hard and unreadable. After a long moment, he spoke, voice low and steady. "This land is watching?" No one laughed. Eleanor tightened her grip on Virginia. The baby, strangely calm, cooed at the river like it was an old friend in disguise. No one crossed, not yet. Instead, they set camp a safe stone's throw back, where the river couldn't whisper quite so loudly, and all night long, the sound of water rushing the wrong way carried through the trees, like a lullaby written in reverse. They came upon it at twilight, a CROATOAN village nestled in the trees, quiet as snowfall, the kind of quiet that made even the birds forget their songs. No signs of struggle, no blood, just absence. And the strangest part? Supper still steamed in clay pots over gently smoldering fires. Fish wrapped in leaves, corn mashed in bowls. It was as if someone had said, "Leave," and every soul had obeyed without time to blink. Eleanor stepped softly, Virginia bundled close. John Dare stood beside her, mouth ajar. Near the edge of a round dwelling, a child's twig doll sat propped on a stone step, arms out as if asking, "Did you see where they went?" The huts were untouched. Baskets of nuts and roots sat waiting patiently, as if the villagers were simply out picking more. But the ground was wrong, too quiet. Even the crickets had taken the night off. Mateo knelt beside the fire, placing his palm just above the heat. His face darkened, eyes scanning the trees. "They left only minutes before," he murmured. "Why?" someone asked. He didn't answer. A breeze swept through, lifting the doll's crooked arms, making it wave goodbye, or perhaps warning them away. No one slept well that night. The empty village breathed just behind their thoughts, like a place that had vanished just a bit too late. Beyond the quiet edge of the deserted village, just where the trees began to fold into shadow, they found them, stones, flat, ancient, arranged in a deliberate half-circle like seats at a council no one remembered calling. Each stone bore markings, not letters, not pictures, but something in between. Lines that looped and split like branches, or rivers drawn from memory rather than map. Eleanor stood still, Mateo said nothing. In fact, he turned away entirely, eyes locked on some invisible horizon. When she asked what they meant, he only said, "They're not for speaking." She counted them. 13, a number that, in another life, might have simply been unlucky. But here it felt intentional, like a story being whispered just beyond the veil of sound. That night, Eleanor did not sleep, not really. She drifted through a dream where the ground breathed beneath her, warm and pulsing, where eyes opened in the soil, 13 of them, watching without blinking, not hostile, just aware. In the morning, she found a small pebble tucked beneath her blanket, perfectly round, marked with the same curling symbol from the stones. She kept it, of course. Because what else does one do when the forest starts sending mail? And though no one ever saw Mateo touch the stones, each night he walked a wide circle around their camp, as if afraid of what might arrive if one ever dared reply. At first, it was nothing. A soft rustle, a hush in the trees, like the forest holding its breath. But then the hum began, low and round, like a lullaby half remembered. It had no words, no source, only presence. Eleanor felt it before she heard it, a tingle at the base of her neck, like the trees themselves had started to hum. The settlers slowed, then stilled on the narrow path, caught in something between enchantment and unease. Even the birds, usually quick to scold intruders, fell silent. Mateo turned his face to the wind, his expression unreadable. A leaf brushed John Dare's cheek. He didn't flinch. The melody, or was it just vibration, passed through them like breath or memory. Some swore it was a song, others a warning. One man later claimed it was the voice of his dead mother humming her old cooking tune. Another said it was a chant from the stones. Both men quietly avoided one another for the rest of the journey. When the hum faded, it didn't really stop. It just folded itself back into the wind as if it had always been there, waiting. And then the silence, heavy and complete. A silence with teeth. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. Even the forest seemed reluctant to creak. The trees had sung, and whatever it was they'd said was not yet finished. The fire crackled gently, sending tiny sparks into the velvet night. Most of the settlers had already curled into sleep, their dreams likely tangled with forests and songs. But Eleanor remained awake, cradling little Virginia in her arms, rocking ever so slightly, as if swaying to a tune only she and the trees could hear. The baby blinked up at her mother, eyes wide and wondering, little fingers grasping at firelight. Eleanor smiled through the ache in her chest, humming an old tune from Devon, one her mother used to sing when the wind was wild. She hadn't realized she was crying until a tear dropped onto Virginia's cheek. Then, softly, a sound, a word, too clear to be imagined. Gone. Eleanor froze. Virginia blinked again, then, clearer still, and just as certain, gone. It wasn't the sort of baby babble most mothers hear first. Not mama, not milk, but something deeper, older, as if the child had pulled the word from the roots of the island itself. Eleanor held her closer. She wanted to believe it was just coincidence, the echo of a wind, or the accidental cooing of a sleepy babe. But nearby, the trees rustled gently, like they were listening or answering, and for a long moment, even the fire stopped crackling, as if it, too, was trying to understand. It began just after the fire had quieted into embers, when the stars blinked down like usual, distant, harmless, uninvolved, and then The sky cracked open, not with sound. There was no thunder, no gust of wind, no warning, just silence, thick as honey. Then came the lights, streaks of green and red darting across the heavens like ink spilled across a map. John White, who once sketched constellations with careful hands and a practiced eye, stood frozen. He counted each pulse aloud, under his breath. 1, 2, 3. His voice trembled by the fourth. By the sixth flash, the trees had gone still. Even the night insects fell quiet, as if the entire forest held its breath. A child whispered, "Is it the sky bleeding?" No one answered. The light did not illuminate so much as rearrange. Shadows slithered across the clearing in unfamiliar directions, cast by stars that no longer seemed to obey. Mateo closed his eyes. Eleanor clutched Virginia tighter, rocking her without realizing. Then, just as gently as it had come, it ended. The sky returned to its ordinary glitter. The stars shrugged off the oddness as if it had never happened. But White didn't sleep that night. Instead, he stared upward, as if waiting for a message or a second act. After all, the sky had spoken, but to whom and why was still very much unanswered. The morning mist clung low to the earth, curling around boots and branches like it, too, had secrets to keep. That's when they found it, a tree so wide it might have once held up the sky, its center hollowed by time or something older. Moss grew thick along its base, soft as fur, and its opening gaped like a quiet mouth, waiting to speak. They lit torches, though the light barely reached the far curve of the interior, but even in the dimness, they saw the offerings. Not bones, not beasts, but something far stranger. Tiny figures, woven from straw and reeds, no bigger than a finger, tucked carefully into a dry nest of leaves, some with arms outstretched, some with none at all, and there, beside them, a single leather shoe, small, worn, made for a child who, according to every roll call and worried glance, had never gone missing. Eleanor stepped closer, heart sinking in some place she didn't know existed. Who would leave these? Someone whispered. No one answered. Mateo crossed his arms and muttered something in his language that no one asked to translate. They left the tree untouched, because sometimes when the forest sets the table, it's best not to ask who the meal is for. Dawn cracked like tired eyelids, letting in a pale sliver of light over the camp. 3 colonists sat by the dying embers of the fire, shivering, not from cold, but from something they couldn't quite shake. They'd all woken screaming. Same name, same breathless terror. Agnes. The word curled in the air like smoke, soft and strange. None of them knew an Agnes. None could say where they'd heard it before. Yet their voices trembled on the vowels, like children repeating a bedtime ghost story they secretly believed. Eleanor, cradling Virginia in the shawl worn thin from holding, knelt beside them. Her face, drawn by sleep and worry, twitched at the sound. She knew that name, somehow, not as a person, but as a sound from her childhood. A voice that once echoed up from the bottom of a stone well on her grandfather's farm. Just once. Late summer, long ago. She wanted someone to come down, Eleanor whispered. No one replied. No one moved. The forest around them seemed to lean in, listening too. And for the rest of the day, no one fetched water from the well. Not because they believed in ghosts, of course, but because superstition always wins when the dreams get too loud. It was just past twilight when they found it. A towering pine, standing apart from the others, as if it had grown in quiet defiance of the forest rules. From its bark, something wept. A dark red sap, thick and slow, oozed from a gash near the base. It trickled down like a wound too old to heal, collecting in a small pool among the roots. At first, someone joked it was wine. Perhaps the tree had finally had enough of the colony's troubles and needed a drink. But laughter died quickly in that place. Mateo stepped forward, quiet as dusk itself. He knelt at the base, eyes locked on the liquid. His fingers dipped into it gently, reverently. For a moment, he just watched it stretch between his thumb and forefinger. Then he made the sign of the cross across his chest, slow and deliberate. No one spoke, not even the birds. Some trees carry old stories, Mateo said finally, not looking up. This one remembers. The colonists backed away, shoes pressing lightly against moss that didn't seem to give. That night, the wind in the branches made a sound like breathing, and in their dreams, the trees stood taller still, whispering names only the roots remembered. The river had turned glassy that morning, so still it seemed afraid to ripple. They followed its bend in silence, boots brushing reeds, until they saw it. A boat, English in make, small and sturdy, bobbing half-heartedly where the current met the shore. Its wood was waterlogged, but not old, not abandoned long. Inside, a basket of food, cheese wrapped in waxed cloth, dried apples, even a small tin of salt. All fresh, all untouched, but no oars, no sail, and just there, resting on the seat like it had floated down from heaven, or maybe somewhere far less comforting, was a single perfect white feather. No smudge, no dirt, not a speck. The colonists stood still, unsure whether to feel blessed or warned. Maybe someone went for a swim, one offered weakly. In their clothes? Another replied. Eleanor said nothing. She just stared at the feather, her fingers tightening on Virginia's blanket. Mateo crouched by the water, peering at the boat's shadow. Things come down this river, he murmured. Not all of them leave again. No one stepped aboard. The boat stayed there, rocking gently in water that had nowhere to go. Like it, the colony too seemed to be waiting, caught between currents and watched by something just beneath the surface. It began with a whisper at the edge of camp, then a giggle, not the pleasant kind, but the sort that made even the fire shiver. Thomas Harland, a wiry man known mostly for complaining about beans, had started muttering under his breath. At first, they thought he was sleep-talking. Then they realized he was fully awake and speaking backward, not just scrambled words, entire thoughts, reversed and dripping from his mouth like honey turned sour. He stared blankly into the trees, eyes flicking as if watching invisible birds. When Eleanor gently asked him, "Thomas, who are you?" he smiled with cracked lips and whispered, "He who waits in green." No one knew what that meant, but no one wanted to know. He refused food, blinked only once every few minutes, and sat beside the fire at night, humming tunes no one taught him. Songs that made the flames lean slightly away. Mateo offered him herbs. Thomas ate the pouch. By the third day, he no longer slept, just sat watching, muttering strange riddles into the ground as if roots could hear him. Whatever illness it was, it didn't touch his body. It only curled around his mind, whispering truths meant to stay buried. And Thomas? He just listened. At dawn, the waves whispered secrets, dragging their hems along the beach like tired dancers. The colonists wandered toward the shore, expecting driftwood or maybe a fish too tired to swim. Instead, they found patterns, spirals, interlocked shapes, palms pressed into the earth as if two invisible hands had played a quiet game of patience beneath the stars. The sand was undisturbed around them. No footprints, no dragging marks, just silence and geometry. Eleanor stared at one shape that looked eerily like an eye. "That wasn't here yesterday," she murmured. Thomas Harlan, still very much unwell, leaned in and said, "He draws when we dream." That didn't help. Mateo refused to step closer. He simply muttered something in his native tongue and backed away, eyes low. "Not wind, not wave," he said. "Not for us to read." But the children were fascinated. One tried to copy a spiral with a stick, and the stick snapped. Just like that. By midday, the tide began to erase the symbols, slowly, reluctantly, as though the sea didn't want to wash them away, but had no choice. That evening, someone drew one of the shapes into the dirt by the fire. No one admitted to it, and no one erased it. It was nearly midnight when Eleanor found it. She hadn't planned to check the birthing stool. Why would she? It had sat untouched in the corner of her tent for weeks, gathering dust and memory. But something pulled her toward it, a shiver maybe, a dream she couldn't remember. She lit a lantern and crouched down, brushing her fingers along the wood, worn smooth by pain and prayer. Then she saw it, carved on the inside of the seat, where no hand should reach, where no tool should fit, was the word again, CROATOAN. Not scraped carelessly, but etched deliberately, each letter curved as if written slowly, thoughtfully, intimately. She sat back hard, breath caught in her chest. No one had been near it, not even her. Virginia had learned to toddle near it just days ago. Could the child have? No, impossible. It was carved from within, from beneath. By morning, others gathered, whispering in uneasy ripples. Mateo refused to look. Thomas Harlan smiled for the first time in days. "It likes her," he whispered, and then walked away, laughing to himself. Eleanor covered the stool with a woolen cloth, but she could still feel the word there, pressing upward from the wood, spelling something they still didn't understand. At dawn, the camp felt wrong, too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ribs and asks you not to breathe too loudly. Eleanor stepped out into the mist. Virginia cradled close and saw it, the beds, all 6 of them, empty, still shaped by the weight of sleep, the blankets gently steaming in the morning chill, no torn fabric, no scattered tools, no prints in the grass, not even a snapped twig, just a circle of small stones placed neatly where their sleeping heads had rested, like a quiet punctuation mark left by something with its own kind of grammar. Someone gasped, someone else whispered a prayer meant for louder moments. They searched, of course. They looked behind tents, under canoes, even in the trees, but the missing had melted from the world like breath from a mirror. Thomas Harriot murmured, 6 is 2 3s. He did not explain. Mateo simply turned toward the forest and muttered, "Not taken." Called. That night, no one sang. Even the fire flickered in a strange rhythm, as though trying to remember something. And Eleanor? She did not sleep. She just kept counting the remaining faces, again and again and again, as if numbers could protect them now. Eleanor knelt alone in the forest, the soft hush of dusk settling around her like a second skin. She whispered a prayer, not quite to God, not quite to anything in particular, just a prayer flung gently into the twilight, like a message in a bottle set adrift on leaves instead of waves. That's when the owl came, silent as breath. It landed on a moss-covered stone beside her, a large, solemn thing with feathers like smoke and eyes like lanterns from another world. It didn't blink, it didn't move. It only looked at her, as if deciding whether she should be told something or warned. And in its glassy, golden gaze, something flickered. Not the fire behind her. There was no fire, only the breeze, the leaves, and a hush so deep it pressed against her bones like an old memory returning uninvited. The owl tilted its head, just slightly, as if amused. Eleanor didn't run, she just whispered, "I know you." The owl made no sound, but when it finally flew off, its wings didn't stir the air, and where it had perched, the stone was warm, warmer than it should have been. The Roanoke River shimmered under twilight's hush, as if wrapped in a silken hush stitched by forgotten hands. The reeds along its banks rustled with a rhythm that was not wind, not frog, not anything quite of this world. It began as a hum, barely a note, more like breath exhaled through hollow bone, and then, faint and impossibly far, yet close as thought, a melody floated out from the rushes, not sung by any human voice, and yet undeniably singing. Notes that curled and wove through the air like thread, gentle, mournful, and curiously familiar, though no one could say why, like lullabies heard once in a dream, or remembered from a life not quite lived. Monteo stood stillest among them, his head tilted slightly, as if deciphering words carried in the melody that no one else could hear. Eleanor held Virginia tighter, her arms tense, though the baby slept easily in her arms. The child, oddly, smiled in her sleep. Even Thomas Harlan, still lost in fevered riddles and backward murmurs, stopped muttering and simply wept. Some said the water itself was singing, that it was not air moving over reeds, but the river remembering, speaking, offering the last comfort it could. When the sound faded as suddenly as it had come, the silence felt sharper, emptier. They stood for a long while after, no one speaking, as if to break the silence would be to erase what had passed, as if something sacred had been heard, or something terrible had noticed them listening. The fog came in thick that night, but there was no wind, no chill, just that silence still humming inside their bones. Whatever the river sang, it remembered them now. They came without sound, without warning, just there. At the edge of the forest, half-shaped by the mist, as if the trees themselves had grown eyes and stepped forward, Monteo was the first to notice. He paused mid-step, dropping the bundle of firewood he carried, not with fear, but with recognition and something deeper. Reverence, perhaps, or dread. The CROATOAN messengers stood bare-chested in the cool dawn light, their bodies marked with slashes of white and red. The white streaked like bone dust across skin. The red was daubed in ancient symbols, bleeding down arms and legs like living ink. Their eyes were calm, too calm, and their faces were void of expression, as if carved from wood, not flesh. Not a word passed their lips. They did not smile, did not blink. One raised a hand, not in greeting, but in direction, inland. No gesture followed, no explanation, just that one motion. A single finger pointing beyond the clearing, into the deep woods, where no trails led, where even the birds refused to go. Then, just as silently as they had appeared, they were gone. One blink, and the mist reclaimed them. Some of the settlers claimed they'd imagined it. that the morning light played tricks in the fog, but Manteo knelt where they had stood and pressed his palm to the ground. A faint red smear remained, warm to the touch. Eleanor asked him what it meant. He did not answer. He only whispered an old CROATOAN phrase, one none of them had heard before, though it would echo in Eleanor's dreams for many nights after. Those who paint the journey do not walk it. No one slept well that night, not even the children. Something had shifted. Something had begun. He went alone. No one saw him leave, but by the time the sun crept above the trees, John White was already deep within the forest, lantern in hand, beard damp with mist. The others would whisper of it later, how he'd stood still for hours after the CROATOAN messengers vanished, how he hadn't blinked when the morning fire snapped too close, how something had changed in his eyes. He said nothing to anyone. He simply walked. The path wasn't one they knew. It wasn't one anyone knew. It bent where the earth should be flat. It dipped and climbed and folded like breath drawn slowly in a dream. The air was thick, not with heat, but with hush. Even the birds kept their distance. Vines hung like ropes from the trees, heavy with moisture and secrets. They brushed across John White's shoulders as he passed, tenderly, or like fingers. It became difficult to tell where the forest ended and the path began, or if there had ever been a path at all. His lantern flickered against the fog, the flame wavering like it too was unsure. He walked for what might have been an hour or a day. Time twisted among the trees. Light fell through the canopy in trembling strands, not quite reaching the ground. Shadows moved without cause. Leaves whispered names and voices not his own, and yet he did not turn back. The silence was so complete he could hear the press of his own heartbeat. The crunch of leaves underfoot sounded like thunder. He was utterly alone until he wasn't, because up ahead, in the space between two trees, something glimmered. Not gold, not steel, eyes not human, watching, blinking slowly. He took one more step. The path did not continue. It only deepened. John White stumbled into the clearing like a man crossing from one world into another. There, in the deepest hush of the woods, was a circle. 12 stones rising taller than a man, weathered with time, but unbroken. They stood with purpose, with memory, and with something older than either. The ground beneath them was bare, no grass dared grow, just soil, cool and soft, pulsing faintly beneath his feet, like the skin of some slumbering thing. Moonlight spilled through the canopy like milk, falling onto the stones. They reflected it not with brightness, but with a kind of glow that felt internal, as though each rock contained the light of a star that had forgotten its name. And in the center, carved into the stone at the heart of it all, there it was, the mark, that shape from his dreams, the one he could never fully remember after waking. The one that sometimes appeared in frost on windows or the soot of a lantern chimney. The one Virginia once drew in the air with her finger before laughing as though someone else had told her to. He knelt. His knees sank into the soil like it had been waiting. The humming began then, not from the trees or the wind, but from the stones themselves. A deep, low thrum that echoed in his bones, vibrating something ancient in his chest. He placed his hand upon the symbol. For a moment the forest vanished. There was only sky, endless, purple-black sky, and stars falling like rain. And then voices, not cruel, not kind, just Old. Older than language. They didn't speak words. They sang shapes, circles within circles, names with no mouths to call them. When John White opened his eyes again, the clearing was empty. The stones remained, but he was no longer certain he had ever been a man. Night had come without ceremony. No final chorus of birdsong, no sharp wind through the trees, only the slow hush of the fire lowering itself to embers and the distant lap of water folding over itself on the shore. The others had retreated to their tents, too weary to speak, too afraid to name what lingered beyond the firelight. Inside the makeshift cabin, Eleanor sat alone by the candle's flickering edge, the baby asleep beside her in a basket lined with worn linen and seagrass. Virginia's tiny hand curled toward the warmth. Her breath was slow and soft, the only steady rhythm left in a world that no longer obeyed time. Eleanor stared at the blank paper for a long while. She had written dozens of letters in the months since they'd arrived, lists, logs, even lullabies, to soothe herself in the worst hours. But this one was different. This one would be her last. She dipped the quill into ink that was almost gone and began to write. The sea does not want us. We've waited for ships that will not come. We have listened to winds that do not speak our names. And now the land calls us back, not to die, but to disappear. The candle guttered, as if reacting. She paused, hearing a faint shift in the trees outside. A sigh or a name breathed too low to catch. She wrote again, pressing hard enough for the nib to tear the page. If this letter's ever found, know that we were not taken. We were chosen. She folded the parchment carefully, binding it with a thin strip of thread pulled from her own sleeve. Then she lifted a loose floorboard and placed it beneath, beside the seashell she'd kept since her childhood on the Devon coast, and the tiny carved spoon Ananias had given her when Virginia was born. She stood slowly, her joints aching more than she would admit. The baby stirred in her sleep. Eleanor leaned down, pressed her lips to Virginia's brow, and lingered there, whispering something no one else would ever hear. Then she turned and walked into the night. The candle, left burning, flickered once more and went out. Some say it was the wind, others say it was the end of the world, but for Eleanor, it was simply time. It began quietly, almost too quietly to notice. Just after sunrise, the golden light crept along the shoreline like a slow tide of honey, turning sand into amber and shadows into silk. The sea stretched out behind them, not roaring or crashing as it had in days past, but whispering, a tired hush like breath through a veil. The colonists stirred only slightly, each drawn into their own silence, their own unraveling thoughts. And then someone, no one would later remember who, lifted a hand and pointed inland. Above the distant treetops, a single column of smoke curled into the sky. But it was not the color of fire. It was not the gray of camp embers or the black of burning pine. This smoke was blue, a deep glowing blue, tinted faintly with violet. It did not rise so much as hover, undisturbed by breeze or bird, like something unsure if it wanted to be seen. It moved as if time itself were slowed around it, as though it belonged to another world entirely. The scent came next, not wood smoke, not flesh. It was sweet, not floral, nor like any spice they knew, more like memory. The sweetness of warm bread and honey on the tongue, mixed with something else. A note just beneath the surface, faintly metallic, faintly rotten. The kind of sweetness that makes the back of your throat itch if you breathe too deeply. Manteo stepped forward, his face drawn tight with something between awe and dread. He stared at the smoke for a long while before speaking. "This is not for us," he said at last. But Eleanor couldn't look away. None of them could. There was something hypnotic about it. The way it shimmered in the rising light, the way it seemed to pulse faintly, in rhythm with the waves behind them, as if the sea and the smoke were speaking to each other in some ancient, forgotten breath. The birds had stopped singing. Even the insects had gone silent. A feather drifted down from somewhere unseen, pure white, too white, and landed at Eleanor's feet. She didn't pick it up. Then the smoke moved, just slightly. A subtle shift, like the moment before a sleeper stirs. A tremble, a breath held too long finally released. It began to glide, not roll, not blow, but glide, slowly down the slope from the treetops toward the shoreline. Toward them, a child whispered, "It's watching." No one corrected him, because they all felt it. The eyes inside the smoke, the presence curled within its shape. It was not weather, it was not nature, it was will. It had lingered long enough, and now it was coming. They were gone. It was the kind of silence that came with the sound, an ache in the ear where life should have been. No footfalls, no birds, no clinking of tin cups or cries of children, just stillness, thick and waiting. The morning sun broke gently over the tree line, spreading its soft gold over the colony. Doors hung open as if just pushed by a breeze. A loom stood unfinished, the shuttle mid-thread. A bowl of berries sat on a table, one half eaten. A kettle steamed faintly over dying embers, abandoned not long ago. But not a single soul remained. Not one. Not Mateo, not Eleanor, not even little Virginia. Their beds were slept in. Their boots still stood by doorposts. A doll carved from driftwood lay face down in the dust, its threadbare dress fluttering in a wind that carried no scent. The fields were green and untended. Chickens still clucked softly in their coops. And yet the people were as if erased. No sign of a struggle, no trail of footprints leading out, just the colony, still and waiting, as if time itself had paused. Somehow the air remembered them. Their laughter, once echoing under the eaves, seemed to hang there still. Their names, whispered from wooden walls, scrawled in breath across cold panes of glass. Every step through the village felt like interrupting a dream. Every shadow stretched just slightly too long. And the trees had grown closer. That's what John White would later insist. As though they had crept in overnight, roots curling through paths, branches bending low, as if the forest had leaned in to listen and decided to keep what it heard. The animals refused to enter the settlement. They paused at its edges, squirrels, birds, even the wild dogs, watching, waiting, perhaps mourning, perhaps warning. No signs of blood, no signs of rot, only absence, only the empty gesture of a place built by hope, now hollowed by some invisible hand. Later, when others came to look, they found everything in place, tools not rusted, food not spoiled, as if time itself had been gently folded around the moment and tucked away, like a pressed flower between pages, perfect but lifeless. They would say the colony had vanished, but that's not quite right. It had departed, lifted maybe, like breath, or absorbed like water into thirsty ground. The kind of vanishing you feel, not see. The kind that leaves your skin cold and your heart unsure of its beat. Whatever had come, be it the land, the sea, or something older, had not taken them in violence. It had simply taken them. When John White returned, The Atlantic had already taken its toll. His hands, once firm and quick, now trembled from cold and salt. The journey had dragged on for months. Delays, storms, lost provisions, mutinies. He had stared at the sea until his dreams were waves, and still he had held hope like a flame cupped in two tired palms. He landed at Roanoke under gray skies. The wind was colder than memory had promised, and the surf broke against the shore like slow, tired breathing. His boots touched the familiar sand, but something in him faltered, a feeling deep in the bones, a hush in the earth. The settlement stood ahead, or rather, what was left of it. No voices rose in greeting, no smoke from chimneys, no rush of footsteps from beloved faces. He stepped through the outer gate, expecting the joy of reunion, even perhaps a scolding for being late. Instead, he found stillness, deep and waiting. Doors hung open, grass grew in the paths. A swing made from rope and wood creaked slowly in a breeze no one felt. Everything was intact, but the life was gone. And then he saw it, the post, one of the tall wooden beams that marked the entrance to the fort. Its surface, rough-hewn and weathered by the sea, now bore a single word, carved deep, letters gouged with purpose and without haste. CROATOAN. It was not scrawled in panic, not etched as warning or plea. It was deliberate, clean, final. John White stood before it for a long while, his breath fogged in the cold air. The waves behind him lapped gently, and that single word echoed louder than any voice. CROATOAN, a nearby island, a people known to them, a place perhaps of refuge or of return, but he felt no peace reading it, because there were no signs of struggle, no signs of passage, no trail, no note, no message beyond that one word. As though the colony had become an echo, its only remaining syllable carved into wood. He touched the post gently, fingers running over the grooves. They were deep, firm, the kind of carving that took time and decision. But whose hand had made it? Eleanor's, Menteo's? Had it been a farewell, ere a mark left for him and him alone? The sea roared louder for a moment, and John turned, squinting toward the crashing horizon. In that moment, he imagined he saw them, just beyond the foam, a flicker of figures in white, walking the edge of sky and tide. But when he blinked, the vision was gone. Only the carved word remained, and silence, always the silence. To this day, Roanoke watches. It does not slumber the way other places do. Its hush is not absence, but attention. Its silence listens. The air feels held, like breath suspended in reverence. The trees do not merely grow, they lean, as if remembering something. The island is not empty. It is observant, a witness and a keeper, a sentinel standing guard over a story that slipped through the cracks of time. Its shadows fall deliberately. The light feels slower here. The wind, too. It does not simply pass. It murmurs. It carries messages it does not translate. Some swear they hear it speak in old tongues. Not just Old English, but something more elemental. A language of sea and sap, of sorrow and soil. A voice both distant and intimate, like the echo of your own breath in a childhood room. The trees creak like aged doors opening to forgotten chambers. The waves don't just lap, they linger. Some say the surf carries whispers at night, names long unspoken, or lullabies whose singers are dust. Others hear distant laughter or the sound of chairs shifting on old wooden floors. Even the birds here seem quieter, pausing mid-call as if not to interrupt. And the fog, it drapes itself with ceremony, like a shawl around the shoulders of something grieving. It does not roll in, it glides. In that fog, faces seem to form, Not quite there, not entirely gone. Impressions in the mist, not malevolent, not even sad, just present. Watching with ancient, unreadable eyes. By day, tourists pass through. They snap photos, laugh with companions, and read plaques. But the island does not rise to greet them. It waits, it watches. Children play in meadows, unaware that the ground remembers footsteps from another world. A ranger once found small handprints in dried mud, oddly placed, no trail in or out. Another saw light flicker in an abandoned cottage, though no electricity ran there. Locals speak in hushed tones, if they speak at all. One elderly woman, born to the soil of Roanoke, once said, "This place doesn't forget. It just forgives slowly." A fisherman claims to have heard a hymn rising from the shore. 3 voices in harmony, with no boat in sight, no soul around. And a little girl once asked her mother why the people in the woods had such old eyes. Nothing remains above ground, no bones, no ruins, no solid proof. And yet the island feels crowded, full of something, not ghostly in the ghoulish sense, but in the sacred. The past doesn't trail behind Roanoke, it rises through it. Beneath each leaf is a memory. Beneath every gust, a story. There's a heaviness in the quiet. Not oppressive, just deep. Not fear, not grief. Something more primal, something like awe. A weight not of sadness, but of knowing. A question lingers in the stillness, unspoken yet ever present. Where did they go? And then an answer, faint, gentle, felt more than heard. They are here. The island holds its secrets like hands hold warmth. You can feel it in the moss, soft and thick, like forgotten fabric. In the twisted roots beneath the trees, gnarled like stories retold too many times. In the shimmer on the surface of still water, where light dances like fleeting memory. Even the insects hum in minor chords, as if they too know this place is sacred. Some say the colonists vanished. Some say they were taken. Others say they blended with native kin, rerouted, renamed. But perhaps, just perhaps, they transformed. Not physically, but spiritually. Dissolved into rhythm, into echo, into pattern and pulse. Perhaps they are the wind through the reeds, the hush between raindrops, the sigh between sentences. Perhaps they are the stillness that settles over the island each dusk, the hush before moonrise, the softness that wraps you when you close your eyes near the shore. Roanoke is not a ruin, it is a cradle for mystery, for memory, for myth. It does not answer, but it echoes. It does not confess, but it invites. And if you come, and if you listen, not with ears, but with spirit, you may feel it, you may feel them. The wind speaks in riddles here, not to confuse, but to keep the sacred safe. To preserve what should not be owned. It offers no solutions, only stories, only songs in fragments. Only footprints that end mid-path, and sometimes just before sleep, as your thoughts begin to untangle and your breath softens, you may feel the island touch your thoughts, not to haunt you, but to remind you that time is not a line, that stories don't die, they become places, and Roanoke has become a place where memory lives. It breathes in the branches. It hums in the soil. It moves in the mist. It leans in when you're quiet. It lingers just long enough to be felt. And if you listen closely enough, you may hear the island speak softly, reverently. We remember. And in that moment, with eyes half closed and heart ajar, you may whisper back, "I remember too." And so they sleep, not beneath marble crypts or written epitaphs, but under the slow, unbroken hymn of time, under pine and ash, beneath the breath of the wind and the hush of the wave, beneath a sky that forgets nothing, the lost colony, lost only to the eyes that look too hard and feel too little. They are not gone, they are returned to the rhythm of the earth, to the deep pulse beneath soil and sand, to the sacred silence between the calls of night birds, to the dark green sigh of the forest that once watched them come, and now watches over them still. They crossed the ocean with trembling hands and bright eyes, their hearts packed with hope, their dreams sewn into canvas sails. They bore the burden of empires and the fragile weight of new beginnings. They walked into the wild, wide unknown, not knowing it would hold them, keep them, dissolve them into its oldest stories. And now there is no cry, no trace of their campfires, no echo of footsteps. The trees grew tall where they once stood. The vines covered their walls like memory-softening grief. The storms came and went, the grass returned, and still they sleep. No monuments mark their resting place, no voices rise in hymns, but they are remembered in the hush between waves, in the rustle of 1,000 unseen wings, in the stories we tell and the ones we cannot finish. History calls them lost, but perhaps they were only early. Too early for a land not ready to be claimed. Too early for a world still dreaming itself into shape. Perhaps they were not lost, but let go. Let go by a land that would not yield to flags or faiths, that chose instead to absorb them, to weave them into its wildness like thread into moss. Roanoke. The name drifts like a ghost, like mist on morning rivers, like the last words spoken before sleep. It is not a location anymore, it is a feeling, a myth carried gently by centuries, a story that lingers because it was never fully told. We searched for them in the sand, in the roots of cypress, in fragments of pottery and cryptic carvings. We followed shadows through the underbrush, we traced rumors through centuries, but some stories resist the trap of answers. Some stories are not meant to be solved. They are meant to haunt us, to invite us, to move us. The Lost Colony is not a cautionary tale, it is a poem, unfinished, a song with no final verse, and that is its power. It lingers in the space between fact and faith, between what we know and what we feel when the fire dies down and the forest begins to speak. They may have vanished from our records, but not from the land. Perhaps they were taken in, adopted, remembered in new names, new faces. Perhaps they became something entirely other, something entirely new. Not English, not vanished, just changed. And if they did vanish, if they were unmade by hunger or illness or despair, still they remain, in the very soil where they hoped to build something lasting. In the breath of the woods, in the salt of the sea, in the long and lonesome call of gulls at twilight, we think of them as gone. But what if they simply passed into legend not as victims, but as offerings? What if they were never meant to build a colony, but to become part of something eternal? Here, in this last image, no bodies, no ruins, no farewell. Only moonlight brushing the tall grass, only stillness vast and sacred, only the sense that something passed through and remains just out of reach. Not erased, just returned to the dream that bore them. Their stories drift like pollen through the centuries, unseen, persistent, seeking places to root. We speak their names even as they slip through our fingers. Eleanor, Virginia, Ananias, Manteo. Names once spoken in hope, now whispered in awe. Names carried on wind and memory and myth. And in the end, perhaps the truest thing we can say is this: they were here. They mattered, they dreamed, and now they sleep. Sleep not in sorrow, but in stillness, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a presence to be honored. Sleep not as those forgotten, but as those returned to something larger, older, more enduring than empire or map or word. Close your eyes, feel the hush of the clearing, the warmth of the soil, the lullaby of wind through reeds. The story does not end. It simply changes shape. It becomes air. It becomes roots. It becomes silence. They are still here, not in stone, not in ink, but in the pulse of the earth, in the breath between stars, in the hush that settles when the story is over and everything that mattered lingers. And so they sleep, and the land remembers, and the wind carries their dream forever. And that's how 115 people disappeared like leftover cookies in a midnight kitchen. Maybe they found a new home. Maybe they became legends. Or maybe they just wanted to ghost all their responsibilities. Relatable. If you're still awake, thank you for wandering with me through the mists of time. If you're asleep, well, sweet dreams. This was Sleepless Thrills. History so strange, it's almost comforting. Subscribe for more bedtime deep dives. Now sleep tight. The mystery watches over you.